Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves motivation, specifically, as the title states, psychological theories of motivation. Now, whenever we talk about things being psychological, we're pretty much saying that they're learned. This was a huge debate when I was taking animal behavior classes from both the psychological and the zoological viewpoints as an undergraduate, because each sort of had a different idea about where that behavior came from, and sometimes it was the same behavior. But for the most part, when you say something is psychological, you mean that in a way it's learned. Now, I'm putting the mostly here because I'm actually going to point out, well, sometimes it's not as obviously learned as others. Let's just put it that way. It's probably all boils down to being learned, but sometimes it's quite obviously and sometimes it sort of isn't. So when you're talking about psychological theories of motivation, very often you start talking about incentive. Now, you're probably familiar with the word. It gets used in car commercials a lot. New buyer incentives. And what they're basically doing here is they're making you a deal that you can't refuse. They're trying to get you to perform a behavior by giving you something, essentially. In a way, it's kind of like a bribe. If the biological theories of motivation is something on the inside pushing you to do things, psychological theories of motivation is something on the outside pulling you. There's a difference from being pushed and being pulled. Being pushed from the inside, being pulled from the outside. This is something on the outside of you pulling you to do something. So an incentive, like I said, is kind of like a bribe. Or you can think of it as a reward, a reinforcement for doing something. If you buy a car from us, we'll give you a great deal on the interest rate. If you buy this one thing from us, we'll give you another one free, that sort of thing. Now, in terms of incentives, we can break down the motivation that occurs here to two things. The first is called extrinsic motivation. Notice the word extrinsic. It looks a little bit like external. And in fact, extrinsic motivation is indeed when we are motivated by things outside of us. If you do something for an external reward or to avoid an external punishment, that's extrinsic motivation. Okay? I'm doing this because I get paid for it. Extrinsic motivation. I'm doing this because if I don't do it, then I'm going to get in trouble. Extrinsic motivation. The thing is, though, a lot of the things that we don't do because we're going to get paid for them or rewarded for them in some way, or we do to avoid an external sort of punishment. Sometimes we do things, we perform behaviors, simply because we like them. We like to do that behavior. The behavior makes us happy. Or if we don't do it, we'll be bored, which is bad. That's intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is internal, where you do things because of internal reasons. So it's kind of learned, but kind of not, because this is where the mostly comes in. Because it can be very difficult to tell why a particular person likes to do a particular activity when others don't. Sometimes it's because of reinforcement or you learned that it's fun, but sometimes we just like things. And maybe we like it, for instance, because we are sensation seekers and we like things that are exciting. Or, it gets very complicated here. So, extrinsic motivation is stuff that happens outside of you that's pulling you. Intrinsic motivation is when there's still something outside that's pulling you, but the reason it's pulling you is because there's something inside of you. For instance, I am intrinsically motivated to read. I read for fun. I read for fun all the time. I am literally sitting here right now recording this with a book open next to me that I'm trying very hard to not read. I need to go put it away because I need to record these things. But I am intrinsically motivated to read. I read for fun. I do it all the time. And this confused some people because a lot of people are not intrinsically motivated to read, or at least they're not intrinsically motivated to read the sort of things that I'm intrinsically motivated to read. And so I would be walking around, for instance, in graduate school, I would be walking around with these big, thick books on some arcane subject, and people would look at me and say, "Oh my God, what class are you reading that for?" And I would say, "I'm not reading it for a class, I'm reading it for fun." And they would look at me as if I were an alien, which I may well be. Simply because For a lot of people, you don't read big, thick books for fun. Unless it's a Harry Potter book or something, but that's a whole nother thing. People may be intrinsically motivated to read Harry Potter, but when you offer them another book, they're like, no. Again, it's complicated. But on the other hand, there are people that will do things for fun. For instance, well, I'll use myself again. In my spare time, I like to do community theater. I like to get up stage and sing and act and dance, sometimes all at the same time. And I know an awful lot of people who would rather be shot at sunrise than do that. That would be like the worst thing ever for them. And in order for them to get up on stage and do that, there is going to have to be an awful lot of money involved, or something along those lines. Or in the case of my classes where I have people do presentations, there needs to be a lot of punishment involved if they don't do it. Then again, of course, I look at people who go to amusement parks and strap them into themselves into small cages that get flung up into the sky on giant bungee cords. And they pay money for that experience. You know how much money I would need to be paid to do that? The amount is incalculable. Because I'm not going to do that for fun. Are you kidding? No, but they do. I would need to be extrinsically motivated to do it, but they're intrinsically motivated. They're doing it because they think it's fun. I would only do it if I got a lot of money. That's extrinsic. And these are different for everyone. Okay? One of the things we as humans tend to do, which is not correct, is to assume that everyone else thinks like us and feels like us and likes the things we do and doesn't like the things that we don't like. And that's one of the things you kind of have to take some time to realize, is that just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that everybody does. Like I said, it's a common human habit that people get into. One very interesting thing, by the way, about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is that they don't mix very well. There have been a lot of efforts recently to try to get children, and by recently I mean like the last 40 years. This has been going on since I was in grade school. The idea is that it's best if children read for fun. Children who read for fun tend to do the best in school, tend to do very much better than children who don't read for fun. Because quite frankly, to become a good writer, you need to read a lot, and you need to read a lot of good things. Texts and such don't count. So there have been a number of programs, particularly summer programs, that are trying to get children to learn to love reading by reinforcing them, by rewarding them to read. Extrinsic motivation. What these kids do is they read and they get rewarded for every book that they read, or for every page they read, or number of pages that they read. The hope being that if you reward kids for reading, they're going to learn to love reading. And even after the program is over, they are likely to read more on their own. These programs have not been really successful. And part of the reason is probably because, as I said before, it turns out that extrinsic and intrinsic motivation don't really meet, as it were. Animal trainers have known this for a long time. One of the best ways to get rid of a behavior that you don't want is to reward it. And if you've listened to my lectures on conditioning, schedules of reinforcement, you're going to find out why. Because if you reward a behavior constantly and then you stop rewarding it, the behavior is going to stop because it's no longer getting rewarded. So if you have a dog that jumps on you and you want to get the dog to stop, teach the dog to jump on you when you give him a signal, and the dog will stop jumping on you when you don't give the signal. How does this bode for these programs where they're rewarding kids to read? They don't bode well. And in fact, it's quite possible that these programs are teaching kids not to read. They're teaching children that reading is only something that you do for a reward, that reading is work. And we don't like to do things that are work. We like to do things that are fun. We like to do things that are intrinsically motivating. And in fact, if you extrinsically motivate a behavior, if you reward a child for reading and that child already likes to read, there's a possibility that that child's going to stop liking reading once that program is over. It's probably why these programs have been going on for 40-some years. In fact, the best way to ensure that children like to read is for them to have parents who like to read. And one would think if these programs worked, then people my age who have children and may well have grandchildren, you'd think that they would have passed down that love of reading, but it's not working. And in fact, I'll bet a whole lot of you, if you think about it, you don't really like to read, not books, not literature, maybe texts, maybe comic books. Why? You don't read those in school, do you? At least not legitimately. It is kind of something to think about when you're wondering whether rewarding a behavior is really a good idea to make that behavior continue. I suppose they could try to put it onto some sort of schedule of reinforcement, but again, that's kind of difficult because we want them to read for fun and not to read because they need to. Most of us, our jobs are on a partial schedule of reinforcement, but that doesn't mean that we love our jobs and would do them even if we weren't being reinforced, does it? Whenever you're talking about deciding to do something or not, whenever you're trying to make a decision, do I want to do this or not? Do I want to go there or not? Do I want to have this or not? You're always talking about expectancy, even if you don't know that you're doing it. And expectancy motivates us. That's why it's in this chapter. It motivates us to either do things or don't do things, to decide to perform an action or to decide not to perform an action. Now, whenever you're trying to make a decision about whether or not to do something, you're always going to follow the following two steps. Now, you may not know that you're doing it, or it may be so obvious to you that you don't have to explicitly sit and think about these things, but you're always weighing these two halves of the scale here to see if they balance. So whenever you're deciding to do a behavior, the first thing you're thinking about is the likelihood of you getting whatever the incentive is. What's the likelihood of you getting that particular incentive? What is the likelihood that you're going to get the reward or avoid the punishment or whatever? Because if something is going to be, if the likelihood of your getting something is pretty much 100%, the odds are you're going to do it, right? Because you're going to get what you want. You're going to avoid what you don't want. But when it starts to get more dicey, it becomes more difficult. Sometimes with my students, for instance, I give them this hypothetical. It is hypothetical. I give them this hypothetical example. And that is, let's say that I looked at people's grades and I realized that grades were not what they should be. And so I said, okay, I am willing to give out extra credit points for written papers on a topic in psychology of your choice. And then I sort of asked them, how long would that paper need to be before you would not do it? Or should I say, how short is the paper before you would do it? If I said a 2-page paper for 10 extra credit points, pretty much everybody goes yes. A 10-page paper for 10 extra credit points, pretty much everybody goes no. Why? 2 pages you can knock out in 15 minutes. 10 pages is going to take some work. And it's going to be less likely to get there. So with 10 pages, no. 2 pages, sure. It's easy. We can get the incentive. It's fantastic. So that's one of the things that we weigh when we're deciding to do something. But there's also the second that plays just as big a role, if not sometimes more of one. What is that goal worth to us? Because if there is something that you absolutely have to have, you're probably willing to move heaven and earth to get it, right? But if it's something that isn't really important to you, then whatever, you get it, you don't get it, who cares? So this also plays a role. Because then I say to my students, okay, what if instead of 10 extra points, the incentive would be a guaranteed A in the course with no more work required? I have people volunteering, hypothetically, volunteering to write 20 and 30-page papers. Because it may eat up a weekend, it may eat up a whole week, but then you're done. And you have an A. And you don't have to worry about it anymore. So that much work is worth it. So those two are always balancing each other out. How much is it worth to me? And how likely am I to get the thing? And sit and think about the decisions that you make. I mean, something as simple as where to go to lunch. You decide you want to go out to lunch. Great. So what do you think of? Well, we could go out to lunch here because it's close, but the food isn't necessarily that good. We'd have to get in the car to go to this place, but the food's a little better. Which one are you going to go to? You're always weighing and balancing these two sides when you're deciding to do something. particularly if it's something big or life-changing or something very important to you. And we often find, by the way, making those kinds of decisions very stressful. And I'll talk about that more in the stress chapter.